hello there, everyone. We are back. I'm in the middle of doing phone calls. My neighbor's dog is barking. I just had to try to take care of that. If you have a dog, public service announcement before we go any further. If you have a dog and you leave it outside all day and it barks all day, that's actually cruelty to animals. The dog is not happy when it's barking like that. And it's traumatized. And when you let it go for 2, 3, 4, 5 hours at a time, it's actually pretty cruel for that animal. So my advice, stop doing that. That would be awesome, and your neighbors will appreciate it. This is another Q&A. I love these because you weird people have weird questions, and I like weird. And so I got good questions this week. I think a lot of these are, for whatever reason, there's no theme involved here. And I'm one person with one opinion, so take it for what it's worth. And if you disagree with me, that is perfectly fine. That's what the world's about, is about disagreements and fighting. Just remember that. Lots of analog film questions here for God knows what reasons, people. Film is dead. Did you not get that memo? 1997-ish. Sammy's LA parking lot talking to a digital tech rep for one of the camera companies, and they were looking at me and he was like, film is dead. You have to use digital. That era. Oh, I remember it so fondly. All that hate's gonna burn you up, kid. It keeps me warm. My spirit animal is C. Thomas Howell. I think you're starting to get an idea of how my brain works now, by the way, jumping from topic to topic. Question number 1. Hey, Dan. I have a question for you next Q&A videos. Well, here we are. I know your opinions on photography and social media. Do those comments still stand for Flickr? And if they're different from Instagram, Facebook, can you elaborate? Choking up. The short answer is yes, I do differentiate Flickr from Instagram and Facebook. Flickr was the first real, to me, the first real, powerful, cohesive online photo community. And it was a community that was based so much on the actual imagery and the conversation, dialogue, and community that was built behind it. Flickr was a very impressive organization, and I was never really on it. I had a Flickr account, and I probably still do, but it was only because Blurb asked me to do it, and we were doing some sort of test or whatever, and I had to have a Flickr account, so I started one. I also knew pros that used Flickr as an archive. And actually, if you go back and research some of the weird shenanigans that went down with Flickr when they first started to auger in, some of those shenanigans tie to a photographer who was using Flickr as an archive. And he was a very intelligent guy who would embed a unique keyword with all of his work. So this unique keyword, anytime an image of his would pop up anywhere, he could do the SEO search. And if that keyword had been used somewhere, it would pop up. And it turns out he had found some of his work had been sold without his knowledge for like mouse pads and coffee cups, and he's like, what the heck's going on? And so I think Flickr was doing some things they shouldn't have been doing, but this is years ago. And I think that the Flickr community to me felt like a real community where people were not so driven by, oh my God, tell me I'm great, tell me I'm great. Every ounce and every minute of every day is going to be self-promotion and marketing to try to make money off of this. There was an innocence to Flickr. Having said that, there was an innocence to Facebook and an innocence to Twitter going back to the original origins of those platforms. I know because oddly enough, me, Mr. Anti-Social Media, I was one of the first people on those networks in my circle of friends. I was on Facebook before any of my friends were talking about it. I was on Instagram very early on. I was on Twitter going back really to the origins of Twitter. I happened to be in Amsterdam at a creative festival, and I heard the word Twitter for the first time, and the founder of Blurb and I looked at each other and we were like, what's Twitter? And then we got on Twitter, and there was an innocence to all these things. Facebook and Instagram immediately lost their innocence. Twitter immediately lost innocence. As soon as these became marketing tools, people just lost their mind. And we're still mired in the middle of it. But Flickr still, to me, feels like photography is the singular thing that is of importance on Flickr. And yes, I'm sure there are people who are trying to drive their numbers on Flickrs. It's not entirely innocent. I think that's just human nature. Competition is human nature. But I am a big fan of Flickr in comparison, although again, am I going to spend time putting work on Flickr? No, because I don't really have a dog in the hunt. I'm not really, as you know, I'm not Mr. Photographer anymore and haven't been for a long time. Yes, I did go to the University of Texas. I did, and I graduated, believe it or not. But the standards were low. I think I was a quota graduate. I know I certainly was in math. Okay, question number 2. Oh, this is a question about drawing film. If I have any tips for drying 35 millimeter black and white film so that it dries flat. The bane of analog photographers, flat film and dust. Those are the two things that are always going to be front and center in your mind when you're processing a roll of film. Yes, you want your time and temperature and agitation and chemical mix to be just the way you want it, but all of that loses a bit of luster if you suddenly figure out that your film is curled and it's not going to lay flat in the enlarger, or it's not going to lay flat in the scanner, or you've just got a ton of dust and then you have to go in and spot. Now remember, people, I'm old. I came through when we didn't have Photoshop. We had spot toner and a paintbrush, and you had to spot tone your prints. And if you had a scratch on your negative or you had dust, this could take hours and hours and hours, and you had to mix from pure white, black, pure black, and all shades of gray in the middle, and basically painting, spot toning the dust out of your prints. There were times where I just looked at a neg and said, this is an amazing pick. For me anyway, this is an amazing pick, but I don't want to take the time to dust this or spot this. It's too bad. I had negative cleaners. I had little brushes. I had every gimmick in the book to try to keep my negatives clean. When you live in a place like Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is incredibly dry and incredibly dusty, here the degree of difficulty goes up exponentially. Southern California was easy in comparison. I printed plenty of stuff in darkrooms in California for decades and never really had a problem. Drying film, you have the sort of hair dryer metal tube with an engine on top with a motor and heat that blows down, and you put your reels up into it. There's a little metal latch at the bottom that keeps the reels in. I was never fond of those because the reels at the top that were closer to the heater would get 150,000 degrees. They were like the surface of the sun, and then all of the moisture from those top reels would flow down to the reels further down, which were much cooler, and they would end up with photo flow and spots and everything else on the bottom. I don't like that way of drying film. What I much preferred was a film cabinet where you can hang the film from the top. The entire roll is coming down exposed in a straight line with a weight on the bottom that keeps that film flat and keeps it as flat as possible, but also it just dries more evenly. And then other than that, I sleeve all my negatives, and you can actually try to press those negatives later with photo books is a great way of doing that. It's the same thing that people did trying to make their prints flat. You print fiber and bring it out of the wash here in New Mexico and leave it on the drying rack, and a fiber print will literally curl up like a ball. It's so dry here. And to even flattening those out without crimping the corners or putting a crease into a print, I've ruined plenty of prints here in New Mexico just trying to flatten them. So you just have to experiment. I do like drawing my film when it's extended, when the entire roll is hanging, as opposed to drying it on the reel. I hope that was helpful. I don't think it was that helpful, but who cares? It's my channel. I can do whatever I want. Question number 3 is, did I miss something here? Sometimes people write saying they're writing me a question, but they're just talking. And so I read through these long things, and then I go, there's actually no question here. They just wanted to talk, or just wanted to share something with me about, I don't know, a V600 scanner and wet mounting a negative. I don't know. Or shooting Tri-X at 250. Oh, there I did it again. I hear my neighbor's dog barking. Oh, it's annoying. Okay, let's see here. What question were you on here? 3. That person just wanted to talk. Okay, question number 3 is, when do you know it's time to abandon a project and move on to others on your list? Sometimes I have ideas and I start to execute them, but feel they might be a dead end. So I think you can't hide from the negatives. You can't lie from the negatives. The negatives are going to show you what you have and what you don't have. And depending on what the project is for, if you're just doing a personal long-form project, there's no photo editor, there's no art buyer, there's no curator, there's no gallerist, there's no magazine editor, there's no one telling you you don't have what you need. So I've done plenty of personal project stories where I look at it and I might have spent 5, 6, 7 years on these projects on and off, and I look at it and I go, this is okay for now, but it's not complete. And I may either continue on that project or I may say, you know what, I'm just tired of working on that project. I want to go do something else, and I move on. So the big difference happens when this work is being done for a specific thing. For example, if you're going to do a book project, let's say that you're commissioned to do a project and you're going to spend X amount of time and it's going to end up as a photography book, then you have to really say, geez, I need to make sure that I got my T's are crossed and my I's are dotted and everything else. And so I think if it's a personal project and you're a consumer photographer and not working as a professional, it's really about love. Do I love this project, or do I have something to say? Am I trying to tell a story, and have I compiled enough images to tell that story? And if you have, and you feel sound in your decision by saying, I think I'm okay, I've got everything covered, then move on. Or if you get into a project thinking you're going to love it and you don't, there's no reason, no pressure to say, I got to continue this. Oh, I started this, I got to continue it. You don't. This is life. You can do whatever the heck you want. I've started projects, got into it and said, I don't love this. I've also started projects that I got into and I shot for 5 years on a project once, and I realized because of a variety of combinations, a variety of things that were outside of my control, I was never going to get the A story. I was only going to get B or C level material because I was never going to gain access to the A level. It took me about 5 years to figure this out. And yes, it was kind of a bummer at the end of that to say, man, I'm not gonna get this. But one of my friends who was someone I photographed for the story, who happened to have some of the ingredients that would have been required to do the story, said to me, look, I didn't want to discourage you. I could have told you this 5 years ago that you were never gonna do that, you were never gonna get access, but you were bent on doing this and I didn't want to stop you. But 5 years into it, when I went to him and said, I can't continue this anymore, he said, I can't believe you did it this long, because yes, you're not going to get what you want, and it's not within your control to get that. You've done everything you can to try to get access, but you're not going to. So I moved on. Now that work, that story, taught me a ton of stuff and also gave me connections that I'm still in contact with today. I'm still friends with today. I still run into people. In fact, here in New Mexico, there were 2 or 3 different parts of that story that I happened to work on in New Mexico before I lived here. And I'm still in contact with those people, and I still go to those places. So even if you don't technically finish a project, it can still be incredibly beneficial moving forward for your subsequent projects. Number 4. Again, analog film. What's the matter with you people? Analog. How do you archive your film work? I know throwing the negatives into the shoebox and under the bed, then never bothering yourself about it again is how it is for most people, but I'm asking about the sorting, categorizing. Do you use any specific equipment? Do you sort chronologically or location-based? Any additional tips? And I think he's got, and there's a second part of this. Let me just talk about film archiving. So first of all, use archival materials. You want, whether it's a glycine sleeve or it's plastic sheets, negative holders, or it's boxes that you're using, or any of that material, you want to buy archivist material. That's step 1. Step 2 is a lot of times when film comes back from labs, I'm not sure how it is now, but back in the day, sometimes your film was sleeved in clear sleeves, and sometimes those sleeves were archival and sometimes they weren't. So if they weren't, you had to take your film out, toss those, and then use archival sleeves. Sometimes, though, film would come back just in a glycine envelope where all of your negatives were basically rubbing against each other, but it was in a glycine envelope. And so that's not a good storage strategy either, because you don't want your film rubbing on itself. So you want to use really good materials. And then I'm a fan of stacking film vertically because I don't want the pressure and weight of the film on itself if things are laying flat. So everything in my cabinets, all my film archive, are in archival plastic sleeves, inside of archival boxes, inside of an archival sort of container, and then those are stacked vertically. And in terms of how I label them, they're basically labeled by subject matter. So on the outside of the boxes, I have labeled what work is inside the container. And remember, I mean, I shot for, I don't know, let's say conservatively 25 years of doing assignments and work. It wasn't that much. So, and some of the projects I did that took 5, 6, 7 years to do, it's pretty simple to just say like Sicily box, you know, and the dates of when I was there. The first trip, second trip, third trip, fourth trip, North Shore of Oahu, you know, Man versus Nature, all these projects that I did, they're just stacked up vertically and they're labeled by content. Now with digital, it's a whole different scenario, because with digital, I shoot so many random things, not knowing how or why I'm going to use it in the future, because I'm not doing assignments and I'm rarely doing stories, and most of this is just filler for some of the other content that I have to make. So digital is way more difficult for me to archive, and especially over time. That's the reason I ask for archive questions coming up, because my friend Fleming and I are going to do a film where we talk about this. Fleming is a Denmark-based, Fuji-sponsored Red Bull music photographer who's compiling a ton of data, and he and I were talking offline about, I'm like, I got to get a cloud solution. I've got to get a NAS. I've got to get something. I've got 40 terabytes active in my office, but I don't have access to it when I'm on the road. And that's just 40 active terabytes. That does not include the 50 to 60 terabytes of content that I've already got. And where the heck do I put that? And I actually have to pull from that on a pretty regular basis. And this speaks to also the concept of archiving and building an archive. And so many young photographers, and actually not all of these people are young, but a lot of folks give me grief about talking about an archive in general. That is the most bewildering concept to me, that you would be trying to work as a professional photographer and not building an archive. What the heck are you going to do later in your life? Are you going to be licensing your work, or are you going to be penniless because you didn't take the time to build an archive that you could then license into the future? People, this is photo 101, and these people that are talking about photography won't be of value in the future, you're out of your mind. If your photography is not valuable in the future, that's your problem. Then you're not making stuff that's good enough to be of value. So many photographers I know are living off of their archive. And for some reason, I think when people look at that, they assume that it's so difficult and so unattainable that they just pretend that archives are not something that's going to exist in the future, or that there's no way to possibly use that to supplement your income in the future. You are out of your mind. I get asked for work all the time that I shot 10, 20, sometimes upwards of 30 years ago. I get people asking about that stuff. And licensing images, which means people will license an image from you over a certain geographic area, over a certain timeline, with certain exclusivity to that file. And that's how people survive. A lot of times, like magazine photographers in the 80s and 90s, they might have made whatever, $400 a day with expenses to work on a magazine contract, which is nothing. That's like poverty wages from the 1970s. But knowing that, yes, they'd get that little bit of money up front to do the assignment, but then that work would then go into their agency or go into their own personal archive, and they would relicense those same images over and over and over again. And back when I was working, you had something called an embargo, where you would shoot for a magazine, do an assignment, and they would embargo that work for 3 months afterwards, meaning no one else could use it. So the magazine, even though they knew that you were going to relicense that work at some point, they would say, okay, we know you're going to do this, but we get 3 months of exclusive use of this imagery, and then afterwards you can do with it what you want. And so that was an integral part of being a photographer, was licensing and relicensing of the same work. I know people today who are relicensing images for exhibitions. So for example, you take a bank building in Sydney, and the bank wants to have artwork on the walls, and they just don't know what they want. So smart photographers are going in and saying, well, don't buy this work from me. License this set of prints, this exhibition, license the exhibition for a year, and then in a year we'll come back and you can either relicense it if you want to extend it, or you can license something new. And then if they want something new, they pull those images and license them to someone else. That is what an archive is about. If you are obsessed with the now and thinking that getting something on Instagram is what's going to make you, you are in for a rough future, my friends. Okay, I think that was 4. And the second part of that question was, how did I feel about Norm Macdonald passing away? And did he have any influence on me? Norm did not specifically have any influence on me, although I loved him. I thought he was great. And here's the thing, whether it's Norm Macdonald or Sam Kinison or George Carlin or any of those folks, Dave Chappelle, humor is gold. In our society, in a world where there's so much hate and so much negative energy and animosity, and the division lines seem to be getting deeper and wider, and the stupidity level seems to be growing exponentially, humor to me is a free fire zone. There should not be rules about comedy and humor. And so anyone like Norm Macdonald, anyone like any of these comedians that are their job in life is to make you and I laugh, to give us a moment of respite from the lives, the drudgery of the everyday life. I'm dealing with a barking dog and my neighbors. I've got to drive my van over and give it online. I got to teach for an hour and a half and listen to an investment program for an hour and a half. It's, you know, I love the teaching part, but the barking dog, the taxes, all this stuff that we have to deal with in our lives that's not necessarily fun, comedy is a respite. Comedy is an oasis of saying nothing matters. You know, I love the fact that we can make fun of each other and make fun of ourselves, and that's what comics did. The fact that the physical release and the positive transformation that happens to your body and your brain when you're laughing, comedians are a goldmine. And what's scary to me right now, and I think Norm, the fact that Norm is no longer with us, in some ways he lived through the heyday of comedy, because now we're in this culture and society where comedians are getting tagged and getting bashed for doing things that are putting, you know, they're basically, people are now saying to comedians, well, you can't say that. Oh, you have to be in this box. Oh, you can't do that. Oh, you're this and you can't say that. That to me is a disservice to the whole thing. Comedy should not have rules applied to it like that. It's about laughter, and yes, we are pointing a finger at ourselves and each other and humans and saying, look, as a species, we're a mess. And we always have been and we always will be. So let's celebrate the fact that we're a mess by laughing about it instead of fighting. I mean, comedians to me are national heroes. They're national treasures. And Norm, one of the great things about Norm was how many other comics he influenced. So it's one thing to influence someone like me, a civilian, who's not a comedian, but it's something else to have so many generations of comics say, I want to be that guy. I want to learn from him. I want to do what he's doing, and I want to see that success. That is a very cool thing. Okay, I think this is question number 5. I think it is. I know you read an unimaginable amount of books yearly. What are your thoughts on Russian literature? How does it compare to American literature or Western literature in general? Any favorites? This year's been a little slow for me. Being in the van was harder to read as much as I normally would. I think I'm just finishing my 50th book for the year. And I don't really care if I read 40 books or 80 books or whatever. It's not a competition for me. I just catalog them because I get so many people asking me about what I'm reading and what I like, which is why I post all the books I read, not all of them, but many of the books I read on Shifter, because if I like it, then maybe you will as well. Russian literature is what I would call extravagantly beautiful and dense. It's enduring literature that to me is a reflection of the Russian society and culture, and it's also a reflection of of even things like Russian weather. The fact that you're in this absolutely frigid place for 6 months a year, it's incredibly cold. There are vast distances in places like Siberia with very few people, a very hard way of living, and I think it's reflected in the literature. I also think there's a poetry of the Russian language that is unique to the world, and I think the observational techniques of Russian authors are unique. So it's not like I don't view Russian literature as light reading. I think it's life-changing reading. And when you're about to sit down to something that you know you will have to endure. So Russian literature to me, even though it's so beautiful, you have to endure it, because a lot of the great works in Russia are long, that take long periods of time to get through. And I think, I don't know, for me, that's a reflection of the culture and society. And I think America is like an amusement park in comparison. And I think that's what makes our literature so interesting and different and beautiful compared to Russia. One is not better than the other. They're just entirely different philosophies about how to put words on the page. So I like it. I don't read a lot of Russian literature. It's the kind of thing where you kick yourself, and not everyone's going to learn to speak Russian, but I would imagine that reading literature, those same authors in Russian, without having to translate, would be very similar to reading Japanese authors in Japanese. I think that would be such an interesting twist to be able to do that, because I think you would get an even fuller appreciation for what these folks have actually done. All right, number 6. I'm enjoying your videos. Hey, Dan, since you got big into photography, bravo, you did a fantastic job. I took more photos when I was a teenager. All right, this is a long one. This is like a long story, and I'm going to try to cut through this, and I think there's a question in here somewhere. I often think about how I might best approach work that could span many years' time, perhaps continuing until I'm really and truly old. One project in mind would take me across the U.S., staying 1 month at a time in every state. Let's see, 1 month times 50 states equals 50 months, plus 3 months of travel equals 53 months, 12 equals 4.5 years. Not an eternity, but an expensive, time-consuming endeavor that when I stop to think about it makes me clam up, and I think I might be better off sticking to the making pictures and the bumblebees flittering around in my backyard. I think the question in here is you're trying to make something lasting. You want a long-term project. You want something that you can work on for the rest of your life. The one wrinkle in that makes me pause is the travel. Anytime you're hitching your wagon to something that forces you to travel, your degree of difficulty just went up, your degree of expense went up, and your carbon footprint just went up through the ceiling. And it bugs me to no end to see these sort of concerned photographer types talking about being environmentalists while they're getting on a plane every week. I mean, I know photographers who claim to be environmentalists that will literally fly from New York City to pick your foreign destination, Buenos Aires, or they'll fly to Serbia or wherever just to get points to keep a certain mileage number on their airline. And I'm like, you are not an environmentalist. You are not. You can talk about it and you can claim to be, but when your actions betray everything that's coming out of your mouth, those two things don't coincide. Even folks who are traveling, talking about climate change, who are flying back and forth to Antarctica 10 times a year, how do you justify that? If you want a lifelong personal project, try something small, try something simple, and try a concept instead of a story. So, for example, birding. Let's say that your life project is birding. You can bird anywhere. You can bird in the middle of Manhattan. You can bird in the Arizona desert. You can bird in Alaska. You can bird any physical location. You can bird in the middle of the ocean. You're going to still find birds in the middle of the ocean. That is something, and you can turn the simple idea of birding into a personal concept that you find a little wrinkle that's yours. And you can do that. And that is something you can work on passively anywhere that you are in the world. And I actually think that's a wonderful idea, because a lot of times we put pressure on ourselves to come up with story ideas that are completely and utterly impractical, that end up driving us crazy and everyone around us crazy, because you look at it and say, I'm never going to be able to pull this off or finish this. So I love concept. I mean, I saw a project once that someone did on covered objects. Objects that were covered. Think about that. There were broken parking meters with a bag on it. There were cars that were sort of classic cars that people hadn't finished restoring, that were covered with car covers that were left in front of their house. I've seen people do projects on colors where it's like a certain shade of red, and they would just live their lives and they would travel and they would do their job and they would do everything, but they kept running into this specific color and this specific palette. And color palette itself is a project in itself. If you study the history of color and the history of palette, that is a whole nother language that you could turn into a myriad of projects that require zero permission. They don't require model releases. They don't require location releases. They don't require contracts. They don't require any of those things. That is beautiful. And so the bumblebees in your backyard could be that project. Bees are going away. I don't know. Maybe you start archiving what's there and you end up with images that people are looking for. I actually know a really famous photographer who's also a beekeeper, and he does these black and white studies of bees that are, frankly, incredible. I got one in the mail from him because I send him stuff in the mail. And he sent me something back, and it had this itty-bitty print. It's probably 2.5 by 2.5, and it was a black and white portrait of this bee. And it was gorgeous. It was like an X-ray. It was absolutely phenomenal. I still have it on my desk. That's the kind of thing you're going after. Trying to do a news story that's involving people that you're going to travel to every state for a month, and then you've got to You've got to sustain yourself out there. That's hotels, gas, food, and then what's the project? And then also a month is nothing. To get access to some projects, it's going to take you 6 months just to get access, and then you're going to have to be in the field with the folks every single day to get trust. I don't know. I would do something a little more conceptual. All right. Let's see here. Let's see. I think this is 7. I don't know. Oh, this is an interesting question. Also about film, but it was about when I was working as a photographer and doing assignments that were film-based assignments. This is pre-digital. How did I go about getting the film? Where did I buy it? And how much did I travel with? And how did I travel with it? So, 2 things. I always had film on hand, and I had a range of film on hand, whether it was color, neg, transparency, or black and white. I always had all 3 on hand at all times. But when you were doing assignments, you were charging the publications or whoever you were working for, you were charging them for the film and the processing, and you were also marking that up exponentially. You weren't just saying this roll of Tri-X cost me $4.50. You were like, this roll of Tri-X cost me $20. And so the film and processing markup was just a way of making a little bit more money back on the project, but also the logistics of getting your hands on that film cost you something. So all of those costs were always passed on to the clients. And I think a lot of times these days, photographers are like, oh, there's no way that that's how it happened. Oh yeah, there were photographers that I assisted for that were charging $100 for a roll of film and processing, and the clients were paying it no problem. It was just the same as saying, you know, let's say, for example, you had a news magazine cover. A lot of folks who kind of didn't know would say, you'd say, okay, well, if you got, you know, space rate on a half page inside was $400 a picture. But the cover, if you got the cover of the magazine, that was like whatever, make up a number, $2,500. And it was like, wow, you got a cover. Oh, that's worth $2,500. The truth was, if it was a famous photographer and they were on the cover, they often made a lot more than $2,500. That photographer would dictate more of what they wanted to get paid. It wasn't like young photographers like me that would come along and they'd be like, well, our day rate is $375 a day plus expenses plus travel or whatever. These people would be able to dictate because they had the power. They were successful, famous people, and when they were on the cover, they were getting a lot more than $2,500. So I would travel depending on the assignment. If I left to fly to another continent to work on a personal project, I would take between 40 and 50 rolls of film in lead bags. And I would sometimes double up those lead bags. I would always try to get hand inspections, and most of the time people were pretty cool about getting hand inspections. The Europeans did not like Americans, at least at the time. I had real problems in France. I had real problems in Switzerland. I was accused of being a terrorist. I was, you know, the Swiss just went off in the airports about like America was the root cause of all evil in the world. My family, by the way, my mom's side is from Switzerland. That didn't help. And they'd be like, you know, every flight to America is high risk, and if you don't x-ray your film, we're not letting you on the plane. The French love to do that as well for some reason. I didn't really care. I had lead bags. And here's the comedy of it. You show up with your film in lead bags. Hey, how's it going? I'm early. I got plenty of time. This is film. This is what I do for a living. I've got 50 rolls of film. It's outside of the plastic containers. It's in plastic bags. You can see it very easily. I would love to get a hand inspection. French customs. Not possible. Not possible. Have to run your film through. I'm like, come on, I know, but like legally I'm supposed to have the right to get a hand inspection. They don't want to hear that. They're going to, if you can't even say that to them because they're going to go berserk. So you're like, well, I'm going to play along with this, blah, blah, blah. We are not letting you on the plane unless you x-ray your film. I go, okay, go ahead. Then they run it through and it's in a lead bag and they can't see it, so they have to open it and hand inspect it. And no one acknowledges that fact. They're never going to give up. They're never going to say, oh, geez, we should have just done this. They're never going to acknowledge it because you're standing there with a little smirk on your face saying, I knew this was going to happen. I tried to save you from this, tried to save face, but no, you got to do it. And it happened in more places than that. It started to get weird about 20 years ago. Flying into Latin America, I had like 3 film cameras, probably 50 rolls of film, and I saw on the customs form, do you have more than 12 rolls of film and more than 1 camera? And I was flying into Manzanillo, Mexico to do a shoot. And the airport in Manzanillo is like right on the beach. It's really cool. And you head south and you circle back north along this big rock off the coast and you come in. It's cool. It's like, it's a cool area. And I was like, what is that? Why are they asking that? And what I realized was that customs and immigration and the airlines and TSA and their infinite wisdom, this was, by now everyone had gone digital and there were cell phones and like everybody had digital cameras, but they were so arcane in their thinking that they thought, oh, pros must all still be using film. And so if you've got more than 12 rolls of film, and how they came up with 12 as an arbitrary number, I have no idea. If you have more than 12 rolls, you must be a pro. If you have more than one camera, you must be a pro. And I was thinking back to my uncle when I was a little kid who had 2 Nikons my uncle's not a professional photographer. He just loved photography, but he had 2 Nikons. And I'm like, he's not a pro. And so the whole time I would, like customs, they were just looking for ways of going after pros. And so you had a choice. You could either announce that you had this stuff and then you're really hosed, or you lied about it and you took a chance and got through customs without anyone knowing. And so it was always like a question of like, am I going to admit that I have this stuff? That was a mess. Hang on a second. Time out. Do I look different? It's probably 8 hours after I started this film. The dog that was barking this morning when I started this film, still barking. It's impressive. Torturing their dog, letting it bark all day long. Anyway, I'm back. Man, what a day. I was in the van on the computer for all day, and I taught a class for college. They asked me to talk about blurb, and I talked about creativity, photography, blurb, print in general. It's kind of a presentation I've given many, many times, but I love giving it because if I could go back to the time that I was a senior in photojournalism school and have somebody who had been in the field for so long come back and actually give me a little crack, a little window into the actual realities of being in the field, that would have been awesome. I didn't get that. You know what I got? The grand total of what I got in school was a paper safe. And for those of you who don't know what a paper safe is, you're printing in the analog darkroom, the wet darkroom. You take your paper out of the box that it comes in from Ilford or Kodak or Agfa or whoever you're printing with. And instead of having to open and close that packaging over and over and over again, which isn't exactly light tight unless you're doing it right, the paper safe is a black light tight plastic box that allows you to take the paper from the packaging, put it in the paper safe, and then it's much easier to access when you're in the wet darkroom. And Kodak came to the school when I was there at one point, and believe it or not, that was the only thing we walked away with, was a paper safe. So didn't get a whole lot of practical advice from people who were working in the field. That would have been awesome. So I wanted to get back and finish this Q&A because that's what we do here. We're not quitters unless quitting is advantageous to us, and then, yeah, we're quitters. Okay, let me think about this. Where the heck was I? The last question I think I was talking about was how I acquired film while doing assignments. Occasionally, a magazine would send film, but most of the time it was purchased by me, and then I would charge that back to them, like I said, with a healthy markup. And initially when I started in photography and I was doing stuff, I wasn't really sure about that markup until I was assisting for other photographers and I watched what they were doing. And I was like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Basically, I came out of school, I was completely unprepared to be a photographer. I was completely unprepared for the business side of photography. Some would say I'm still unprepared, but literally I got out with a degree in photojournalism and I basically was decent with making pictures. Decent. Not even low end of good. I was decent. My pictures were in focus. I knew basic exposure. I could make wet darkroom prints, which were useless in the photography world at that point, unless you were selling prints, but nobody was really doing that on assignment anywhere. And I had no business background. I had no graphic design background. I had no real writing background other than doing news writing, which is incredibly stifling. It's a good skill to have because it helps with copy editing and copywriting, but it's also very stifling because it's formulaic in a lot of ways and has to be written for about a 7th grade education here in the United States. So I was not a well-rounded machine when I came out of school, and it wasn't until I started assisting for established professional photographers, and that was both with commercial and advertising work. There was one studio photographer that I assisted for, And then a lot of editorial photographers who were doing stuff for the National Geographic, Time, Newsweek, Life, all of those publications. And the funny part is the studio photographer was a guy who photographed medical parts with a 4x5. And that was like hell. I would have rather stood in line at the DMV. And he loved me because he knew I was not going to try to take those jobs from him. And I loved him because he knew how to light. And when you're photographing a metallic or titanium hip, you don't just throw it on a piece of black seamless and photograph. You have to build a set that doesn't reflect anything around it. So we would shoot Polaroids and we'd spend 8, 10, 12 hours on a single 4x5 piece of film. And that taught me patience because I didn't have any. See? Holy cow. I would reach for my water bottle, but it's empty. This is what happens when I talk for like 4 hours straight. Lose my voice. Let's move on. Question 7-ish. I am reading the photo book Magnum contact sheets. One thought came to my mind. If we talk about technicality of the photos taken, another photographer would also have been able to produce similar photos. So how did Magnum photographers distinguish themselves from their peers? Could it be that they were given the opportunity to cover certain iconic events and there were not many photographers around at the time? That was why the photographs taken became unique. Thanks. I don't think so. People became Magnum photographers. Remember this. If you go back to the 50s and 60s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, there was no carrot at the end waiting, dangling in front of people like there is today. Today, the carrot is social media fame. The carrot is conceivably a lot of money. The carrot is museum shows. The carrot is photo gallery shows. Remember, at the time, there weren't photo galleries. Museums weren't showing photography. There was no grand riches to be made. There was no social media pseudo-fame to be had. These Magnum folks were so driven to do that kind of work. That is why their work was unique. They lived it and they breathed it and they worked harder than you and I probably ever will, under circumstances that would make most of us crumble. Not all, but many. Some of them were dilettantes that had family money, and that still applies today. There's plenty of folks running around with photographer as a title who come from family money or well-connected. I have absolutely no problem with that. If you have family money and you decide you want to be a photographer, great. You could be out doing idiotic things like buying fancy cars and yachts and a bunch of crap you don't need, but you're out pouring yourself into photography. I have no problem with that. Magnum photographers and the ones that I have met and the ones that I know, which is not that many. I've met a ton of them. I don't know that many of them. They are possessed. They are utterly possessed by photography. Some of them are driven by, how do I put this politely? Some of them are driven by that need to be known and need to be famous. And a lot of the famous people I know have that trait, that gene of I need to be known, I need to be famous, I need my work to be seen. That's helpful when it comes to doing that. But for example, most of the time, I've met Abbas, who's a photographer who passed away last year, I believe. And Abbas did a big project on Islam. He's done a lot of projects going back to the Iranian Revolution in '79. When you speak to a guy like that, the depth of knowledge about photography, but the depth of knowledge of things outside of the spectrum of photography. For example, when he's doing a project about Islam, this is not a superficial thing. His depth of knowledge about the religion and about how it functions in the modern world is beyond the average person by a long shot. When I spoke to Philip Jones Griffiths on the street in San Diego and we talked about Vietnam, you know, he basically got booted from Vietnam because he did a book called Vietnam Inc., and it was not a flattering portrayal of American troops in Vietnam. And being a British photographer, I think he was British or Welsh or something like that, they booted him. But when you spoke to him on the street in San Diego in 1996, it was as if he had just left Vietnam the day before. But his knowledge of the theater and the history and the story was, we didn't talk about cameras and photography, we talked about story. And I think all of these people, Kappa was driven. Cartier-Bresson was driven. A lot of these folks, I mean, Susan Meiselas, who did, think about Susan Meiselas going to Nicaragua in the 1970s alone as a female in an industry dominated by white men to go down there and put her life on the line to cover the war in Nicaragua, that is not a looky-loo. That's not a tourist. That's not an Instagrammer. That's someone who's saying, I'm putting everything else in my life on hold and I'm going to go do this. That's what it takes to be a Magnum photographer. That dog is still barking. It's kind of remarkable that, first of all, if the owner's home, it makes the story even greater because somehow they're inside that house ignoring the fact that this dog is probably a quarter of a mile from here and it sounds like it's right outside my door. And if they're home and they're able to endure that, well done, people. But I don't think they're home. I think they just let their dog out and then they just leave and they're probably people that are like, I don't really want this dog, I just have it. I feel bad for the dog. Okay. Question number 8, another winner. Loved your description of black and white versus color photos and how people might react to each. This was from the last Q&A. Maybe a question for next time is how USA Today, my memory of the first color newspaper, changed your newspaper locally to move to color. Seems that their move to national content and color printing was a major event. Appreciate your perspective on that. That is a wonderful question. However, I don't think that USA Today coming out had any bearing on our newspaper switching to color. I think that they had done that prior to USA Today coming out. But however, USA Today to me was the bearer of bad news because I did not like that paper and I have friends who work for them. I love my friends. I don't love that paper. But that was sort of the fast food of the newspaper world. That was the Dodge Aries K or the Chrysler K car of the newspaper world. That was the beginnings of social media in my mind. Social media is famous for a superficial take on everything with nothing in depth and not really fact-checking exactly anything that's going out on the network. And USA Today just came in with that. For me, that was just horrific newspaper design, graphic design. Everything looked the same. It looked like fast food. And it had a severe impact on the industry, but I don't think our paper was necessarily affected by that. I think we'd already switched to color. And we had a better sense of design. We used photographs better. We were not known as a particularly great photographic paper in terms of usage of photographs. We had really good photographers on staff, but the papers that were doing really beautiful work were Philly Inquirer, Boston Globe, LA Times was doing some good stuff, New York Times Magazine was doing some stuff, and then you had a lot of small papers. You had papers in Michigan and papers in Oregon and papers in Utah that were doing beautiful photo essays and like really showcasing. Heck, Albuquerque Journal was, I think, where Nactway started. It was either the Journal or the Trib. I can't remember. At one point, there were 2 papers there. One of them was a very well-known photo paper. And so it was weird. It took a combination of the right management to understand the power of photography, and you had to have the right designers, and you had to have the right photographers, and you had to have the right budgets to allow people to stay in the field long enough to do good projects. And that was very rare. Now it hardly ever happens. I don't look at newspapers anymore. I'm sure that there are a few. My guess is maybe Washington Post. LA Times is probably still doing some stories. I know they have some good photogs, so hopefully they're doing good stories. Okay, one more question, maybe 2. Dear Uncle Dan, so very much appreciate all your time and effort and knowledge with the wit, so thank you for that. Now for the question, when engaged in long-form documentary photography, people-based, reality-based, attached, etc., those are all terms I've used in the past, etc., I feel an obligation to share with you subjects, the prints what I perceive to the final layout before going to print. However, even after a long, long time of working together to come to this point, some people who are an integral part of the project have objections as to what I should and should not print and how to do so. How do you approach an apprehensive person with whom you've been to hell and back in the process when they get cold feet so that while you're so close to the finish line? It's important to understand and share the story the way you've presented it, but all of a sudden they have a change of heart. Is the work just to be archived and never to be seen? The subject of the story is so intimate and fragile, mental health, that I understand the doubt and the insecurity. But I just want to get your opinion on this. Humbly, humanity before photography, always. Thank you. Saludos desde Costa Rica. Hola, Costa Rica. That is a very good question and a very difficult question to answer because it's a case-by-case thing. But what he's asking in general, or she's asking in general, is you've done this project, you've done a long-term project, it's a sensitive topic, it's about mental health, you're photographing people who are vulnerable. they've known all along that your intention is to do something with it, publish this work, and then as you come close to publishing time, they get cold feet, they change their mind, and they say, I don't want you to use this. So you've only got a couple of options here. You know, if you've got a model release, technically you could just say, well, too bad you signed a model release, and you could publish it. But that's a horrible feeling and a horrible way to work. And secondarily, a model release means nothing. A model release will not stop you from going to court. It will not stop you from being sued. So I don't know, photographers out there think a model release is this like ironclad way of saying I can do whatever I want. That is far from the truth. Secondarily, you don't want to have bad blood between folks, and it makes perfect sense. If I'm suffering from mental health and you're photographing me, and then all of a sudden I begin to realize, Jesus, maybe a lot of people are going to see this, and maybe my employer is going to see this, or my family, or my ex-wife, or whoever, it is a vulnerable position to be. And I think the only way to work that out is through long, slow dialogue of walking through exactly what it means to be published, how you're publishing, where that's going to be, the specific kind of publishing you're doing. It's one thing to put an image on Instagram. It's another to put a photo book out into the world that's going to end up in libraries and be around for decades. So I'm assuming there's an educational component, and the person who you're photographing that is suffering from mental illness could be a beacon of hope and positivity for somebody else who has yet to find treatment for their mental health issue. And that is probably what I would do, is say, look, this is not comfortable. This may not be 100% comfortable. This may cause you some grief at some point, but imagine the hope and the positivity that you could bring to people who've yet to find treatment. So the only thing that I can compare this to is when I got Lyme disease and I wrote my little spiel on my blog about Lyme disease. You know, I was like, look, let's say that I got Lyme disease in 2014. And let's say that I put that story out, and then blurb in early 2015 says, you know what, your position's been eliminated, you got to go look for a job. And employers are looking around and they see that, they see my website, which is a normal thing for them to do. If you're going to hire someone new, you go to their social, you go to their website, and they go, oh man, this guy's got Lyme, forget it. I'm not going to hire him. He's going to be sick. He's going to need special treatment. Our insurance is not going to be happy, all those things. And I said, you know what? I don't care, because I've pulled myself out of Lyme tooth and nail, clawing my way back up to the surface. And I'm not quite there yet. I don't know if I'll ever be there. But every single week, I spend time on the phone, on email, on text, on messaging, on Skype with people all over the world who are so sick and unable to function. And they look at me and they go, you've done it. You somehow figured out how to do this. Help me. So to me, yeah, I'm running a risk of admitting that I'm sick, but the positive aspects of that are so far beyond the negative. And if someone doesn't hire me because of that, you know what? F you. I don't care. I'll go find somebody else. So that's what I would do, is I would have a long conversation and I would work through the positives and be realistic about the negatives. Truth is always the way to go. And you just hope for the best. And if for some reason somebody in that project doesn't want to do it, even if it's your primary focus person, then you work without them. That's what I would do. I'm not super aggressive with that, though. I know people who would just say, I don't care, I'm going to do this. That's not me. Okay, last question. Oh, this is such a great question to end on, because it is so out of right field. But the person who sent this is a longtime online friend, and it's maybe the most important question I've ever been asked, because it is clearly the most important television show of all time. We're both fans of Miami Vice. Last year, thanks to a cable station I subscribed to, I had the chance to watch full series over several months. I was amazed at the amount of guest stars, granted they all weren't huge stars at the time, that were able to procure and appear on Miami Vice. Maybe they saw a future of acting. I don't know if a TV series ever did a good a job as they did with guest stars. Certainly not since. Okay, Brad Pitt and Jon Favreau were on Friends, but Miami Vice was at another level. They even had Miles Davis. So my question for you is, what are your top 5 Miami Vice guest stars? And oh, by the way, Miami Vice, the person who wrote this in, he's kind of soft selling this. Everyone was on Miami Vice. Everyone, from the time that show started till the end. I've never seen anything in terms of guest appearances that is more so than Miami Vice. There were something like 27 or 37 people who went on to become pretty serious stars that all guested on Miami Vice. His question is, who are your top 5? And his are Miles, Gene Simmons from Kiss, Bruce Willis, Stanley Tucci, and Ben Stiller. All right, so I've got a little wrinkle on this. Miles Davis is definitely on my list because I'm a Miles Davis fan in general. I've listened to Kind of Blue, like probably more. I probably listened to Kind of Blue than more so than any album ever in the history of my life. I remember exactly where I was. I was in Paris in an apartment on Boulevard Fin de Calvaire when I first heard Miles Davis, and I was like, oh my God, I love this. And I've listened to that album tens of hundreds of millions of thousands of times. So Miles is on my list. Here's a wrinkle for you. Ted Nugent is on my list. Yes, Ted Nugent, who's a wacko, but the episode that he was in is a good one. So I'm going Ted Nugent. I'm also going Jimmy Smits because he was in the first episode of Miami Vice, and he dies at the end of the first episode. And he's like a star, and he dies at the first episode. So yeah, I got to throw him a bone for dying in the first episode because look what he missed out on. My battery's going to die. The Bruce Willis, Stanley Tucci, Ben Stiller. How about Phil Collins? Phil Collins, I'll take Phil. How about Chris Rock? They're all on there. It's hard to differentiate. But Miles and Ted and Jimmy Smits for dying in the first episode. So I'm going to go before this battery dies. I appreciate you being here. I'm one person with one opinion. I'll be back with more Q&As. If you have more questions, please, by all means, send them in. I love answering these things, and hopefully that was helpful.